You know, for a guy who's called Mad Max, he's pretty chill. Then again, it is Tom Hardy. Actually, he was way more mad in Bronson than he is in this movie. Hey everyone, David here. So what is quickly becoming one of the most critically acclaimed and best reviewed movies of the year, starting a week ago, Mad Max Fury Road has finally been released. And this movie caught my interest for a while because of just how it looked. From the trailers I was like, damn, this feels kind of old school, but at the same time keeping it fresh, keeping it real. And then I noticed it was directed by the same guy who did the original Mad Max movies, which I should point out, much like with the Fast and Furious franchise, I have never seen, or at least in their entirety. I remember watching some bits and pieces of Beyond Thunderdome on TV one time, but besides that, I have never actually sat down and watched all three Mad Max movies. From what I've been told, I should start with the second one, Road Warrior, which actually gets referenced at the beginning of this movie, but Road Warrior is what a lot of people were saying it's the best Mad Max movie. Definitely check it out. The other two, but the sequel, that's where you gotta start from. And now I feel like people will be recommending either that or Mad Max Fury Road. And considering that it's the year 2015, that is saying a lot. And in the movie, Max, played by Tom Hardy and not Mel Gibson, escapes what they call the Citadel, in which he was being held prisoner, and encounters this woman named Furiosa, played by Charlize Theron, and she is trying to smuggle these group of women out of the Citadel as well, so they kind of have a common goal, and they try to work together in order to escape this evil... I can't remember his name, but he is the one in charge of the Citadel, and so everybody engages in this battle between these heavy mechanical and highly modified cars, and it's just rampage. It's just like carnage. It's like car born, just explosions and everything. There's no way to actually summarize the movie without simply just telling you to go see it, because I'm not kidding. This movie is one long chase scene from beginning to end, with a couple of pit stops along the way to let the characters as well as the audience breathe, because you can't just have a movie continuously running, otherwise you're going to run out of fuel. Man, that was the best analogy I could ever think of. And the fact that this movie is by definition an action movie and nothing else, it doesn't get too dramatic, but at the same time it doesn't get too lighthearted to where it tries to mimic the style of the Marvel movies. It still stays true to that old school R-rated type of action movie from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's like it takes the best out of those generations and combines them into one movie to remind people what it means to go to a movie and witness an action blockbuster up on the screen. And at the same time, critics who have been complaining about some of the problems that have plagued the action genre recently, with jump cuts and shaky cam and characters not being really all that developed, so that we're never really invested when they're put in peril. This movie just fixes practically all of those things. And what helps is the fact that the guy who directed this, George Miller, is the same guy who directed those original three movies back in the 70s and 80s. The dude's 70, I looked him up, I did my homework, and he still has it. I mean, the style of this movie is just frenetic. I'll warn you right now, if you suffer from epilepsy, I kind of recommend you, when they head into into that huge sandstorm, I highly recommend you walk out of the theater if you suffer from epilepsy. Granted, you probably shouldn't be in the theater in the first place, because that's generally not a good environment for epileptic people, but still, that scene, the style and the visuals and the effects are just perfect. And what really makes this movie is the fact that all these effects are practical. All of these cars are real. Like, never did I think that they were fake. They are real cars. They're driving these things around. I'm not sure if they're fully functional or even legal for that matter, but they're real cars. They're practical effects. This dude really is up there playing the guitar, and honestly, this vehicle was my favorite. The giant one with all the speakers. You got the drummers in the back, and then you got this guy not only playing guitar, but also launching fire from his guitar. Holy shit. But whenever the action did happen, it was all practical. It was all stunt work. There were real explosions. It was just exhilarating, and the editing really worked, and there's not a whole lot of shaky cam. that George Miller is able to stabilize the camera while at the same time adding his own style of zooming in on things and making things kind of frenetic. He does accelerate the frame rate just a little bit in certain scenes, but still it works. You know, it's not like that throughout the entire movie. It's just when the tension is really rising, and just, these are some of the best action sequences you're going to come across in some time. I mean, trust me, this just, it's a definite throwback. It's a good thing I'm watching this on a Thursday, because this is a definite throwback Thursday to those original blockbusters from the 80s and 90s that relied on practical effects and stunt work. And sure, he does use CGI as a crutch. I mean, literally a crutch. And I mean literally because one of the characters in this movie has a robotic arm, and there's certain parts of that arm that you can tell was CGI helped put that thing together, because otherwise that wouldn't have been possible back in the original days, back in the days of the original Mad Max movies. And ever so often there's an action sequence that is going at such a high velocity that they couldn't help but use some CG to help them out. But that's what CG should be, a crutch, something to help rather than to make it the actual focal point of the story. And that's what George Miller nailed with this movie, is just focusing on practical effects, using CG here and there to help him out, but also making us feel invested in the story and in these action sequences, and feeling like these characters are in peril by giving those characters certain traits and certain things that make me feel for them and make me care about them and make me wish that they wouldn't have died or anything. All the actors do a spectacular job in this movie, and every character was really well layered. I mean, again, it still focuses on the action, but it also tries its best to have these moments where the pacing does slow down, but it never feels disjointed. It doesn't feel like all over the place. You just need to take those breathers, where sure, you just got out of this really cool action sequence, so when you get to these slower parts that, like I said, hardly ever happen. There were just like 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, but in these moments they utilize them. They're not boring, and they utilize them to give these characters certain traits that make you care about them. For me, my favorite was Charlize Theron's character, Furiosa, who was my favorite because she's an empowered woman. She has this motivation to smuggle these women out of the Citadel, and she was badass, and at the same time had this backstory to her that was very sympathetic and made me care about her. And at the same time, what I liked is that they didn't spoon-feed you almost everything. Like, she doesn't have an arm, but they don't really need to explain why she lost her arm. You can kind of connect the dots yourself. And then you also got Nicholas Holt's character, who's Hux, something like that. It's one of those names where they just mention it once and then they just carry on with the movie without ever mentioning enough times for me to be able to remember. But I definitely remember his character because he was also cool. He plays like this eccentric, what they call war boy, who simply just wants to be grand. He wants to bask in the glory of being respected by his peers. It doesn't really matter what side, but being that he fell on the side of the war people from the Citadel, he is from that faction. But later on, he realizes that certain things don't appear as they should be. And if there was one thing for me to complain about these characters, it would be that his character kind of makes a turn that I liked, but at the same time, much like with Age of Ultron, I wish we could have seen a little bit of development because it kind of happens in just one scene. I wish he would have seen some other things that would have fully changed his mind instead of saying, yeah, I'm going to do this now. And they also got the girls that she has to smuggle out of the Citadel, and even they were cool. At first they were kind of worrying me because I was kind of scared. I was like, I feel like these girls are just going to be in the way, they're going to be damsels in distress, or they're going to be rescued. And that kind of happened once at the end, I'll admit. But besides that, they were still able to win me over as the movie went on, and the screenplay gave them characteristics that I appreciated. Like one of them is interested in guns, and the other it makes this connection with this elder woman later on in the movie, and they each one have a certain trait that, like I said, they don't have to give them this humongous backstory because it's still an action movie, but still enough little things to make you care so that when the action goes down, you're fearing for any one of these people's lives. Same thing with the villain. I mean, the villain was really, really cool. First of all, look at this. He looked amazing, and what's even more amazing is the fact that recently, much like with the director being the original director of the first few movies, the actor who plays the villain in this movie is actually the same exact actor who played the villain in the first one. And I know this from IMDb, and I think somebody shared a photo that looked like a meme, but it was like one of those informative memes. And it said that this is the same guy from the original who played the villain in the original. It's the same guy. Like, man, these people are dedicated, but on top of that, he looked cool, and again, small characteristics to make him have a motivation to go after these people. I mean, he wasn't the most developed villain, you know, he's no Darth Vader. But still, you don't need to know every single thing about him. He's simply just a villain. There are heroes you have to go up against, but at the same time, he has certain things in the background that flesh him out more than the average two-dimensional villain. And on top of that, again, he looks cool. Look at this mask. Look at that hair. I can definitely see so many people cosplaying as this guy in Comic-Con coming in July. Now, all these characters are cool and all, but if you've noticed, I'm kind of failing to mention a certain someone. The guy who the movie's named after, Mad Max himself, played by Tom Hardy. And the reasoning behind that is because I did find him to be kind of like the least interesting character in this movie, ironically, considering the movie's named Mad Max. Because he's the man of very little words. You know, he hardly speaks, he hardly emotes, but when he does it subtly to appeal, to make the appearance of a badass, and at the same time, this guy who's going to be leading the pack, so to speak, the survivor. You know, that's essentially what he is. In fact, he has a little bit of a monologue at the beginning of the movie where he's like, "I had just one intention, one instinct: survive." And that's cool and all, but he was the least interesting of the bunch. Now, I need to put an emphasis on the word least, because even though he wasn't as interesting as the other characters, and I was captivated more with them than I was with our main hero here, he was still interesting. He was a badass, he had some cool moments in some of those action scenes, and he did have this certain backstory, like these little flashes of his backstory that kept haunting him. And I'm hoping that's something that they're saving up for the sequel. We already know that this movie's getting some critical acclaim, but now we're waiting to see if it's going to be commercially successful. And if it is, and I believe Tom Hardy has signed on for future sequels, he's on a contract, and if the movie's successful enough at the box office, I'm hoping that if they greenlit a sequel, hopefully in that second movie they'll tackle more of his backstory, because I definitely want to know what was happening with those quick flashes that you see throughout the movie. And that's really about it. I mean, when I walked out of the theater, I figured that this was going to be a rather easy movie to review, because besides those things, like I said, the movie is one chase scene from beginning to end with a couple of pit stops to give you some of those character traits to make you care for those characters whenever the action does go down. Because at the end of the day, George Miller, I keep wanting to call him Frank Miller. Frank Miller, who did Dark Knight Returns, the comic book Dark Knight Returns. But this is George Miller, who happened to do the Happy Feet movies. Mad Max Fury Road, from the director of the Happy Feet movies. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Look it up on IMDb. But what he set out to do was just a straightforward action movie, but he knows what works in an action movie. Like, I feel like, from what I can tell in his filmography, he had some breaks where he practically wasn't really doing anything in terms of making any movies or anything like that. And I feel like in his downtime, he watched enough movies of the new generation to look at them and go, I know what's wrong. I know what the problems are. And after studying, he has returned with Mad Max Fury Road, which is one of the best reviewed movies of the year, and definitely one of my favorites so far. So for that, I give Mad Max Fury Road a low 9 out of 10. Definitely a contender for one of the best of the year, up there with Kingsman: The Secret Service, and maybe Avengers: Age of Ultron. I'm waiting to see what else gets released later this year, but let's just see what happens. But so far, Mad Max Fury Road is definitely one of the biggest surprises of the year. I'm hoping that this movie gets some success at the box office, because I wouldn't mind seeing a sequel. So let me know what you guys thought of Mad Max Fury Road if you have watched it, and I'll see you guys next time.